Let's pick back up where we left off, discussing different things that may be advantageous to do or pursue during your due diligence period. So, of course, we're still talking about due diligence. Insurance is a big thing, folks. Properties, just like people, have a CLUE report, stands for Comprehensive Loss and Underwriting Exchange. It is very important for buyers to contact their insurance company, give them the property address during the due diligence period to make sure that the property is insurable. Older roofs make them more expensive. Floodplains make them way more expensive, have to have separate policies. So you want to make sure that you can get insurance and it's affordable. You want to make sure you get an appraisal to say that the bank is going to lend you the money you need. You're going to get a survey. Surveys are not legally required, but a survey helps identify the property boundaries. It, of course, shows any encroachments, any access to public right-of-way, any title defects that may be present. Zoning, governmental regulations, governmental compliance. This is, as I said, something that is an important discussion. Of course, they've made really big conversations in this recently. And so this is just confirming, hey, we need to investigate if any of the zoning changes are in violation, if it doesn't meet the whatever. And then I'll show you the section where the buyer could get out later. Is there any flood, wetland, water hazard areas? Is there utilities and access? Folks, this is a big one that a lot of people don't think about. There are a lot of builders in North Carolina that are not national builders. They're smaller builders. And what they'll do is they'll buy small lots and then they'll subdivide them into 4 different things and then they'll build 4 different new construction homes. Well, folks, when a big subdivision goes into a very urban area, it's going to have Spectrum. It may have Google Fiber. It may have Ting. It may have something like that. When a builder is building out in a more rural county, Selma or Benson or somewhere like that, it may or may not have standardized internet. And so part of your due diligence is making sure, can you get electricity? Can you get the water? Can you get internet? Can you get all these things? Because imagine buying your brand new fancy home and you didn't think about this. And like me, you work from home and you get in there and internet's not a thing. Folks, that's the problem. So making sure you have the access to the utilities you need. The streets and roads, making sure you understand whether they're public or private. Making sure that there are no road maintenance agreements, that you have public right-of-way access. Of course, special assessments we've talked about. Seller responsible for confirmed. Buyer responsible for proposed. So then it goes in and it talks about some other pieces. Now, this is going to be mentioned again. Okay, this piece says sale or lease of existing property. And so it says, as noted in paragraph 5B, unless otherwise provided in an addendum, this contract is not conditioned upon the sale or lease or closing of other property owned by the buyer. Therefore, a buyer must sell or lease other real property in order to qualify for a new loan or otherwise complete the purchase of the property. Buyer should seek to close on the buyer's other property prior to the end of the due diligence period, or be reasonably satisfied that the closing on the buyer's other property will take place prior to the settlement date of this contract. So it's not conditioned on a contingent sale or anything like that, but if you've got one, make sure you get it worked out in a period of time that you're comfortable in moving forward. Now, D, we talked about in our activity, repair/improvement, negotiation/agreement. Remember, the property is being sold in its as-is current condition, and the buyer and seller can, but are not required to negotiate in repairs, right? They can, but are not required to. Of course, it is a good idea to get your repair negotiations completed prior to the end of due diligence. As I said, not because you legally can't negotiate after due diligence, but if you have any earnest money on the line, it now goes live, as they say, and you are now losing your leverage. Because if you're set to lose $11,000 versus $1,000, you don't have as much leverage to negotiate anymore. So that's why we say you should probably make sure that you conclude all negotiations prior to the end of your due diligence period. Folks, I don't recommend this, and I've done this enough times in my career. It's scary. I would recommend that you get the due diligence negotiations done 3 or 4 days before the due diligence period, because it never fails. When you're trying to get somebody to sign something at 3 o'clock, you got 2 hours left. The seller is always a doctor, a nurse, or somebody. And well, they don't have access to their phone. They can't sign it till after. And now you've got the listing agent saying, I promise the seller is going to sign it. They just can't get to their phone. But if you take them on their word and they don't sign it, now you're going to court, because arguably you're past your due diligence. If you terminate now, the earnest money is on the line. And so I've had to do things in the past where we basically type up an email that says, we are effectively terminating. However, once you sign this, we will consider the contract reinstated with all simple terms. Is that legally sufficient? Probably not. Is it probably the unauthorized practice of law? Absolutely. And so you would probably want to have your clients write up something like that, because for us to do that, probably not legally okay. I'm not saying that it was, but I've done it in the past, because it's a very nerve-wracking position to be in, where your due diligence period is about to expire and you don't have a signature yet on something that's very important to your client. Buyer's obligation to repair damage. This is just a very straightforward thing. It's basically saying if the buyer damages the property in the midst of their investigations, walkthroughs, due diligence, or otherwise, they are obligated to repair it. Of course, the home inspector falls through the roof. The home inspector and or the buyer would be responsible because it's, damage to the property. Now, what it does say is that they're not responsible for things that are considered standard practice under the home inspector licensing board. So let me give you an example. If you've never seen a home inspector, one of their favorite things to do is to take a screwdriver and stab joists and wood and siding and all kinds of things to see if there's any wood rot or soft wood. And so if they stab soft wood and it puts a hole in it, they're not responsible for fixing that damage, because that's the standard of practice for a home inspection to reveal soft wood. However, there are some home inspectors that will go nuts and they're like, oh, you see how soft this is? And they'll jab it and they'll start flaking it off and just completely shredding somebody's siding. And I'm like, okay, that's too much. And so that's the differentiation. Of course, same thing too, if you had like a septic inspection. Well, typically they're pretty good about digging up the septic and like cutting the grass where they can install it. But even if they don't, they're not responsible for replacing the sod where they digged up for the septic inspection, because that's under inspection kind of guidelines as okay. Now, this indemnity, basically this says that, you're not going to come after the seller. You're going to hold the seller harmless if you get injured while you're on their property. It's not their fault. However, it does say that you can go after the seller if it's due to the seller's gross negligence or something like that. So in other words, if you're the buyer at the seller's home and you fall down the stairs, you can't sue the seller because you fell down the stairs. However, if you walk into the seller's backyard and step on a tarp and there was a bear trap set underneath and it clamps on your leg, that's gross negligence. Absolutely, you could sue the seller. So that's what that's saying. Okay, you can't come after them unless they just do something really stupid. Buyer's right to terminate. Remember, under due diligence, provided that the buyer has delivered any agreed upon due diligence fee, buyer shall have the right to terminate this contract for any reason or no reason by delivering to the seller written notice of termination, called the termination notice, during the due diligence period, or any agreed upon written extension of the due diligence period. Time is of the essence. If buyer timely delivers a termination notice, the contract shall be terminated and the earnest money deposit shall be refunded to buyer. Yet again, even though we know that's exactly who's supposed to get it, if there's a dispute, it's going to sit there in the escrow agent's account until we have a signed written release. Now, important to note, there is a form that's like buyer notice to seller of termination. And so that's a unilateral type of document. And so what it would say is, and we'll look at it, buyer is notifying the seller that they're unilaterally terminating. Well, folks, unilateral means they're terminated. So if the buyer sends that notice and says, I'm terminating per my due diligence, the contract is now dead. There is signature lines for the seller on page 2, but those signature lines exist only to release the earnest money. We don't need their consent to terminate. It's already done, right? The buyer's unilateral right. But we would have the seller sign the release of earnest money on page 2 to say, okay, Mr. Escrow Agent, you can give us our earnest money back. That's why we ask him to sign it. Now, this is an important note here, folks, and this is something that I mentioned in previous discussions, and you need to make sure you remember this. Your bargaining position, your ability to try to get what you're supposed to get, is strengthened by your willingness to not close. Because at the end of the day, if you're not going to close, then everybody's at a standstill and you're more likely to get your way. And so we kind of talked about that with seller's failure to remove property from the home. Because here's what it says. Closing shall constitute acceptance of the property in its then existing condition unless provision is otherwise made in writing. Meaning, if you close, good luck getting anybody to do anything. You're not going to be able to, unless you have a supplemental document in writing thereafter that says like, oh well, sellers will come back and make this repair after closing. Yeah, it makes you feel warm and fuzzy inside if the attorney drafts that and everybody signs it. But yet again, if they don't do it, now you're back in court. So your biggest strength comes in withholding closing. Don't close until you get everything that you're supposed to get. So then we get into the buyer representations. Buyers' funds to complete purchase. Are they going to do cash? Now, folks, I'm going to give you some insight here. So it's cash. Buyer intends to pay cash in order to purchase the property and does not intend to obtain a loan or funds from sources other than the buyer's own assets. Verification of cash available for settlement is or is not attached. There are two things that I would consider acceptable for verification of funds as a listing agent and really as a buyer's agent, folks. I hate to say this, and I've kind of said it before, real estate brings out the crazies. Folks, there are some cuckoo birds who, for whatever reason, will pretend to have money. They'll tell you they're millionaires. They'll tell you that they're cash buyers, and they don't got a dime to their name. And they just will run you ragged and make you go see pretty houses, put offers in on houses, and I don't know why. I had a student tell me this in a CE class I just taught a couple weeks ago, that she had clients do exactly this. They kept falsifying documents. They defrauded people. They had charges, and they just went and showed all these houses with her and kept talking about putting offers. And I don't know the reason because they didn't make any money from it. So there are some crazy people. So this is true of buyer's agent or listing agent. Two things that would be acceptable. Number one is a bank statement. Okay, they can block out their account information, but it needs to have their name on it. And so their name, official bank statement with a balance so you can see that they have the money in their account. The other thing that would be acceptable for proof of funds or verification of assets would be a letter from a banking or financial institution. But let me give you a word of advice. If somebody ever gives you a letter from like JP Morgan Chase Bank, says, to whom it may concern, my client, who has a banking account with us, has sufficient funds in order to purchase a home in excess of $2 million or whatever. Here's the thing that you have to do. Do not take that letter with a grain of salt. You need to look at the name of the person who has signed that letter, and you need to find them on LinkedIn to make sure they're a real person. And once you find them online, JP Morgan Chase, this financial advisor, make sure that they have credible resources. They've been there for a while. They've done all these things. You need to call them up and you need to verify that that's actually from them. Hey, this is such and such. I'm a real estate professional. I just got a verification of funds letter that names you on behalf of such and such. And if they say, yep, that's absolutely me, then you're good. But you need to make sure that you don't call any number that's on the letter. You actually call a third-party online resource. Because, folks, there is nothing stopping anybody from typing up a letter and then falsifying a phone number, right? I could put a phone number on there. It's Rob's phone number. Rob and I had a conversation that he's going to pretend to be my financial advisor. So when somebody calls Rob, he's going to be like, oh, yes, this is absolutely Josh with JP Morgan Chase. My client, Seth Chauncey, has $6.7 million in his account and is planning on buying 3 Rolls Royces later today. Is there anything else I can assist you with? Folks, don't call the generic number. It's their friend. It's their brother. There are nutsos out there. You need to call a credible source and verify these funds, both as a listing agent and a buyer's agent, because otherwise you'll be wasting your time with crazies. Okay, don't be rude, don't be invasive, because people who have that kind of money don't typically like super invasive, but they also need to understand. Most people who actually have the money understand the game. We need to verify that you have the money. As much as I'd like to trust you, I can't, and so just be very politically correct about it, but verify. Of course, the other aspect here, if we are getting a loan, tell us about the loan. Are we doing a first mortgage loan? Are we doing conventional? Are we doing FHA, VA, USDA? This is important because, folks, the seller has the right to know what type of loan they are accepting. Okay? No, it's not discriminatory. There are different pros and cons to each different loan type. And I hate to say it, if you are a seller, cash is better than loans, and certain loans are better than other loans. Most sellers would rather have a conventional versus an FHA or VA. Why? because FHA and VA are very high debt to income ratios, meaning you can borrow a lot of money, which means there's a chance that you're, not a guarantee, but there's a chance you have less cash in the bank to overcome any appraisal issues or things of that nature. And then, of course, the other thing is the condition requirement. In other words, FHA loans and VA loans may not be funded if the property needs any repairs. And if the seller's not willing to make the repairs, then the loan's not going to be funded, then the deal is going to fall through and everybody's wasting their time. So sellers may not want to oblige themselves to making repairs. So that's why you have to tell them, what is the loan type? And then understand, folks, if you put in conventional or cash and then you change to like from cash to conventional, that's a material fact. You need to disclose that because that's not what you said. And so that means the contract is materially different than what you said it was. And a seller with a good attorney could probably get out of that contract. So please be aware that it is a material fact that your loan type, your funding type has changed. Would have to disclose that. Of course, it talks about the principal balance. Now, folks, this is where you need to have a conversation with your BIC on what their preferred method is. There are two different ways to fill this out that are both legally adequate. Let's say that you're purchasing the house for $400,000 and you were getting an 80% loan to value ratio, meaning you're borrowing 80%. You could come in here and put, $320,000, which should be 80% of $400,000. However, the reason why most of us don't do this way is if we start going back and negotiating instead of 400, 405, 410, that now changes the 80% loan to value ratio number. You'd have to recalculate the math. So what most people have a tendency to do, and it's completely and utterly okay, as long as your BIC says it's okay, we typically will just come in and put something like 80% LTV. And what that's stating is we plan to borrow 80% of the purchase price, whether it be 410, 420, 415, 390, and that's okay. So whatever the loan to value ratio is, it's a very common thing to put 90%, 80%, 75% LTV. And that is a very common standard of practice. As long as your BIC says that it's okay to do that, go nuts. Of course, any second mortgage loans, any other funds from any other sources, disclose those here. Now, I told you, and we've talked about this in the previous exercise, this is not conditioned on any loan contingencies or anything like that. So that's this note again right here. And then we said earlier that it's not conditioned on the sale of any other property. So while it is not conditioned, this offer is not conditioned on the sale of any other property, this one specific section says, but do tell us if there is another property that you have to sell or lease. It's not making it contingent. It's just a disclosure so the sellers can make good decisions on, is this an offer we want to take or not? And that's all this is saying. Other property. The buyer does or does not have to sell or lease other real property in order to qualify for a new loan or to complete the purchase. If they do, what's the other property address? And then you got a couple different disclosure options. We'll check here if the buyer's other property is already under contract. And you could potentially send them the contract with all the information blacked out so that they know you have a contract. Remember, you can never share material terms. So sellers are strongly encouraged to obtain and review the contract on the buyer's property prior to accepting the offer. But here's the other potential, okay? If it's not under contract, that's what they say. Well, hey, our other property is not under contract as of the date of this offer. And more than that, it's one of these things. It's listed and actively marketed with a licensed real estate broker already, but it's not under contract. It will be listed and actively marketed with a real estate professional at some point. Or the buyer is attempting to sell or lease the property without the assistance of a licensed real estate broker. None of this makes it contingent, but these are disclosures that a seller would deem important. Folks, if I've got two offers that are tit for tat, and one, you have a property to sell in order to be able to qualify for the loan, doesn't change the fact that I'll get to keep your due diligence money if you terminate. But at the end of the day, the seller wants to sell. So your offer is not going to be as good as a property where there is no home to sell. And that's why this disclosure is put in here. Tell us if you have it, but it's not making it conditioned on this in any way, shape, and form. That's what it says here. This contract is not conditioned upon the sale or lease or closing of buyer's other property. If the parties agree to make this contract conditioned on the sale or lease or closing of the buyer's other property, an appropriate contingency addendum should be drafted by a North Carolina real estate attorney and added to this contract. Now, I gave you the advice in previous discussions. Folks, don't ever have an attorney draft up a contingency addendum and just add it. You need to have discussions with the seller on if they would even remotely consider it before you make your client spend money on a contingency that may or may not get accepted. Also, I kind of told you with the due diligence, you could make your own makeshift due diligence contingency. I gave you an example of where I did that in a past transaction. I was a listing agent, and they basically gave us like a $500 due diligence just because we didn't have any other offers. And we're like, okay, knowing that if they couldn't get their house sold by a certain date and time, that they're going to terminate, and we would just keep the $500. So it wasn't really a contingency. It was just a low due diligence, but we all understood what was going on. Performance of the buyer's financial obligations. To the best of the buyer's knowledge, there are no special circumstances or conditions existing as of the date of this offer that would prohibit the buyer from performing the financial obligations in accordance with this contract, except as may be specifically set forth herein. Now, here's where we're going to have some very detailed discussions. I told you, coffee break. I told you that there are 4 very specific things that if they arise, the buyer would be entitled to get their due diligence money back. We've talked about a couple. Here is one of the 4 that I mentioned. Okay. Typically, what happens is the seller will fill out the RPODs and the MOG, and then we will upload the RPODs and the MOG into the MLS in the document section. Now, the legal requirement under the Residential Property Disclosure Act is that the buyer needs to receive the RPODs and the MOG when required prior to them making an offer. Okay? They need to receive the RPODs and the MOG prior to making an offer. And if they don't, there are certain repercussions and ramifications upon the seller. Now, this is very important. I'm going to walk you through this. I'm going to tell you something that you need to be very aware of. When a buyer puts in an offer, they will check one of 3 boxes. The first one, second one, or the third one. The first one says, I have received a signed copy of the RPODs prior to making this offer and acknowledge compliance with the Residential Property Disclosure Act. And so that's what you want to see as a listing agent. And then, of course, the same thing would be true of the MOG. I have received a copy of the MOG prior to making an offer, and as such, everybody's in compliance with the Residential Property Disclosure Act. But here's what happens. If a buyer sends an offer over and they check this box, it says, buyer has not received a signed copy of the RPODs prior to making this offer and shall have the right to terminate or withdraw this contract without penalty, including a refund of any due diligence fee, prior to whichever of the following events occurs first. 1, the end of the 3rd calendar day following the receipt of the disclosure statement. 2, the end of the 3rd calendar day following the effective date. Or 3, settlement or occupancy by buyer in the case of a seller exchange. So let me explain this. If you were to get an offer where they check this box says, no, I haven't gotten it. Let's say that the offer comes in today, July 15th. And let's say that the sellers sign it and communicate acceptance. Our effective date is today, July 15th. You agree? So you haven't received the RPODs, but you're now effectively under contract. And so the clock will start counting. You would have 1, 2, 3 days from the effective date in order to terminate as a buyer. And you would be able to get your due diligence money back, no ifs, ands, buts, or coconuts, meaning 16th, 17th, up until the 18th, you could terminate because they failed to deliver it. And so that's where the count starts. It says whichever occurs first. So if you get under contract without receiving them, now here's a very important note. Folks, no, it's not enough to just put them in the MLS. Because imagine that I put them in the MLS and they're available to you. Remember the parole evidence rule. Only what's in the contract is part of the contract. And so what that means is, even though you put them in the MLS, if your seller accepts an offer and they sign it that looks like this, they get this 3-day out, even though you shared them. So let me show you the other piece. Okay, it says whichever occurs first. Now imagine, I'm going to leave this little count of days up. Imagine you send the offer on July 15th, and this checkbox is checked, okay, saying you haven't received them. And they go, oh crap, you haven't gotten the disclosures yet. So now on the 15th, they send you the disclosures. Now there is physical evidence of them having delivered them to you by emailing them, and the clock starts counting, even though you're not under contract. And so now you've got 3 days from the date they were delivered. So imagine now that they've sent you these disclosures, they decide to sign your offer that's alive and well with no changes and communicate acceptance on the 18th. Well, your effective date is the 18th, and the only time you have to terminate and get your due diligence money back is also the 18th, because the 3 days has already happened. Does that make sense? It's whichever occurs first. 3 days from the date you receive the disclosures, or 3 days from the date that you went under contract without receiving the disclosures, whichever occurs first. Now the last note basically says, okay, well, if you move into the property or close on the property, you've invalidated this right to terminate and getting your due diligence money back. Does this make sense? And so, as a listing agent, folks, let me explain this. If I put the RPODs and the MOG in the MLS, and you ever send me an offer that looks like this, I'm going to say, oh, no. Okay, listen, the RPODs and the MOG are in the MLS. Go ahead and download those, initial them acknowledging that you've received them, and send me a new offer stating, yes, I have received them. Okay, very important. And this is true of both the MOG and or the RPODs. If they say, yes, I got the MOG, or I'm sorry, yes, I got the RPODs, but then go down here and say, no, I did not receive the MOG, if it was required, they still get that 3-day out, and they get their due diligence money back. Okay, very important thing to know. Now, here's why I want you to imagine this can get you in really big trouble. Imagine you don't really understand this, and another agent does. And imagine you're a listing agent, and you get an offer that is satisfactory to your seller, and they've checked this box that says, no, I've not received it, even though you put it in the MLS. Now imagine your seller accepts the offer, you're under contract. Okay? Well, let me paint a picture for you. Carla is my buyer. Okay? And I'm her buyer's agent. I put in this offer for Carla. I check this box. I send it over to David. David's seller accepts it. We're under contract. Now, here's what happens. The next day, Carla picks up the phone and calls me. She's like, oh my God, Seth, I was so excited about getting under contract yesterday, but let me just tell you the funniest thing so we can just laugh about it together so I don't end up crying. I said, well, what you got, Carla? She's like, it's so stupid, Seth. I said, I love the house we got under contract on yesterday, but here's the funny thing. There is a house that I've driven by work every single day. On my way to work, I pass it, and I love that house. And I'm like, oh my God, if that house ever goes on the market, that is my dream house. I would kill to live in that house. Seth, wouldn't you know it, that now that I'm under contract on this other house, this house just hit the market. I saw the for sale sign on my way to work this morning, and I am just devastated. And we just got to laugh, Seth, because if we don't, I'll cry. Because I got too much due diligence money to lose. Okay, everybody see what's happening here. Carla's under contract on a house, and now she's devastated. She's like, oh, but this was my dream house. Well, being the really smart broker that I am, I'll say, well, Carla, listen, I've got a question for you. I mean, do you really think that, like, if you could get all your due diligence money back, do you think you really do want to put an offer on this house? This house is a better house, and you want this one. She's like, oh my God, absolutely. But I know you told me due diligence money is non-refundable, and I can't stand to lose that money. I said, well, hold on, Carla, listen. What had happened was, when we put in the offer, we did not get the MOG from the listing agent. And so we have an out. Carla, we have 3 days from the day we went under contract, and we can back out and we can get your due diligence money. And Carla's going to say, shut up. I said, no, for real. She's like, no, like for real? Like, Seth, like, don't play with my emotions. We can really terminate and get all my due diligence money back? I'm going to say, yeah, absolutely. And she's going to say, let's do it. So now imagine day 2, I send a termination to David, who's the listing agent. I said, David, just want to let you know we're terminating because we have the right to do so under the Residential Property Disclosure Act because we had never received the MOG. I want you to picture what is going to happen here. David is going to go back to his sellers and he's going to be like, listen, we got to have a conversation. I got some bad news. I'm going to say, what is it? And David's going to say, well, the buyers are actually terminating the contract. And the sellers are going to say, well, David, that's not bad news. You said I get to keep this due diligence money. We're keeping this $5,000. That's great news. I don't care. We'll put it back on the market. And David says, well, about that. See, what had happened is they put in the offer that they didn't receive the MOG. And so they legally have the right to terminate, and we have to give them their due diligence money back. And then the sellers are going to say, you mean the ARPODs and the MOG that you had me fill out, the ones you said you were putting in the MLS? And David's going to say, yeah, and I did put them in the MLS, but apparently they didn't find that one. And so when they sent the offer, they said they hadn't received it, and we acknowledged that they hadn't received it. And because it's on the contract that they didn't get it, they have this out, and you got to give that $5,000 back. Folks, I look like the smartest agent in the world. Carla is going to sing my praises to the entire universe. David just got fired. Okay, David is in big old trouble because he said that they would get to keep the due diligence money, but now here it is. They don't. They are legally obligated to return it. Do you see why it's important to understand this provision? Folks, do you think this is a common occurrence? No. But is this something that under certain circumstances could arise? Yeah. Let me tell you when this was a big concern. In COVID time, where houses would hit the market and be under contract in an hour, sometimes we didn't even have time to hunt down the ARPODs before we sent an offer. And so we would put this in there. So then that way, if we got under contract and we saw the ARPODs and they were terrible, that we, of course, could back out. So very important to understand this provision. Now, the last checkbox would be if they were actually exempt. And so remember, the ARPODs, the biggest exemption is new construction, foreclosures, lease with option to purchase where the lessee occupies the property. Those are the biggest ones for the ARPODs, but most resale residential requires the ARPODs. The MOG is really only exempt in commercial sales, vacant land, commercial purchases, because it is the Residential Property Disclosure Act. But new construction does require the MOG. So a very important little excerpt there, little provisions to be aware of. Here's where we talked about the buyer's obligations for certain costs. Remember, we said the buyer's responsible for any proposed special assessments, meaning they're not in place yet. Of course, we talked about some of their costs associated with the closing disclosure. Any and all loan costs, origination fees, discount points, appraisals, credit score reports, title insurance, attorney fees for title searches. All of those are buyer debits. Seller representation, seller has or has not owned the property for at least a year or does not yet own it. This is important to know for closing purposes. As I mentioned, certain loans won't fund if they've been owned for less than a certain period of time, FHA being one of them. I can never remember because it's been so long since I've done an FHA loan. I want to say it's 90 days or 6 months, something like that the seller has to own it before an FHA loan will fund it. And so if you've ever seen like certain open door properties listed, they will very often say in the agent remarks, not eligible for FHA until this date. Why? Because that's the date that Open Door will have owned it for that period of time that allows an FHA loan to be funded by it. Of course, if the property was built prior to 1978, that lead-based paint disclosure. Of course, there is some legal ramifications for the lead-based paint disclosure here as well. And we kind of talked about the lead-based paint disclosure in the seller document section. Seller authorizes and direct any owners association, management company, owners association, insurance company, attorney who'd previously, just information on the associations and dues, things of that nature. Of course, tell us the HOAs, how much the fees are, who do we contact, all the contact information. Now, this fuel piece, folks, depending on if you've taken any other pre-licensing, post-licensing classes or not, this is in the listing agreement as well. And they've started taking a lot of sections from the listing agreement and mirroring them in the sales contract. Why? So that the buyer and seller can have thorough conversations. And so there was a lot of issues with fuel tanks, whether they were leased or owned, the location, were they still in use, were they not, what type of fuel was in there, was the fuel staying, was the fuel going. So this was actually added in a revision, I think 2 years ago. It all runs together. And so, do you own the tank or is it leased? Where is it located? Is it above ground, below ground? Is it oil? Is it propane? Is it gas? Is it something else? Now here's an important kind of piece. Buyer and seller agree that any tank described above that is owned by the seller shall be included in the sale as part of the purchase price free of liens, unless excluded in paragraph 2E above. And then this is where we were having issues. What was happening, folks, is sellers would have these full fuel tanks that they own. And while they were okay with leaving the tanks, they're like, well, I spent $400 on that gas. I'm going to sell it back to the gas company and I'm going to get that money. And so here's what the contract now states. The fuel. The seller may use the fuel in the tank described above through settlement, but may not otherwise remove the fuel or resell it. Any fuel remaining in the tank as of the settlement shall be included in the sale as part of the purchase price free of liens. Seller's use of fuel in any fuel tank is subject to seller's obligations under paragraph 8C to provide working and existing utilities through the due diligence period and up to settlement. So the sellers are not legally allowed to sell back the fuel unless there's agreement to the contrary, but by default it goes to the buyer. This just talks about the inspections. Okay, note, buyer shall be entitled to conduct inspections to confirm the existence, type, and ownership of any fuel tanks. State law provides that it is unlawful for any person other than the supplier or owner of a fuel supply tank to disconnect, interrupt, or fill the supply tank with liquefied petroleum gas without the consent of the supplier. This is yet again just talking about the rights of the property. Is it subject to any leases? Meaning, is there a tenant in place? So the property is or is not subject to any leases. And if there is, then we may need to attach the additional provisions addendum yet again. There is another thing that it does. It discusses the deadline for all oral, verbal, written, otherwise lease agreements when they're going to be transferred to the new buyer. Seller's obligation, of course, providing any documentation necessary to do the closing. Now, this is kind of the new piece, right? Highlighted in yellow, I told you, outlines the new things as of the 2024 revision. As soon as reasonably possible after the effective date, sellers shall provide to the closing attorney all information needed to obtain a written statement of the seller's account from any owners association or HOA management company associated with the property. Seller designates the closing attorney as seller's agent with express authority to request and obtain on seller's behalf a written statement of seller's account as to the property. Upon request from the closing attorney, seller shall immediately pay any fees charged by the owners association or HOA management company for such written statement. And so there had been some issues with consent and getting the information and who owes what and paying the transfer fees. So that's what that's outlining there to try to make it a little more straightforward. Of course, authorization to disclose information, to get it to closing, to all the parties who need it. We talked about this one, access to property. At minimum, the seller has to allow the buyer the right to the property to conduct their due diligence, make sure that repairs were completed, and do a final walkthrough at minimum. And we said that does include existing utilities, arguably. Removal of seller's property, we talked about that. Okay, that is an obligation. Get your trash out, get your debris out, get your personal property out. And if there's anything of special consequence, you may want to put that in the additional provisions addendum. Make sure you remove the tires, make sure you remove the trash, make sure you remove these paint cans, whatever it may be. Nothing too crazy here. Good title, legal access per the 2T. Seller will convey ownership by way of a general warranty deed. Folks, if you remember from pre-licensing, there are other types of deeds: special warranty deed, bargain and sale deed, quitclaim deed. And so when you're using the 2T, the only legal obligation or the only legal allowable conveyance is by general warranty deed. And they have to be able to convey clear title. If they can't convey clear title, they'd be in breach of contract. And if they refuse to convey by way of a general warranty deed, they'd be in breach of contract. And so if you wanted to do anything other than a general warranty deed, don't use the 2T. It is not uncommon, folks, for new construction to convey ownership by way of a special or limited warranty deed. But that's outlined in their contracts, because remember, this is not the only form you can use. This is one that meets the criteria of Rule 58A.0112, and it is a very commonly utilized resale contract. But any contract can be utilized so long as it meets the requirements of the law that was drafted by an attorney. This is just some other notes. Buyer's failure to conduct a survey or examination title of the property prior to the expiration of the due diligence period does not relieve the seller of their obligation to deliver good title under this paragraph. Meaning, if the title search isn't done during due diligence and it's discovered after due diligence there's a title defect, it's still the seller's problem. There is no obligation like, oh no, you have to find this during due diligence. No, a title defect is the seller's issue regardless of timing. And then, of course, this one is talking about a short sale. Short sales are a material fact, and so a short sale would have to be disclosed, and there is a short sale addendum that would need to be attached and added to the property, or to the contract. Here is the governmental compliance section. And as I said, this was a revision back in the 2023 revisions, but they did change some language, and this is that new way where you could potentially get out of the contract and get your due diligence money back. So historically, folks, they were like, when I taught the additional provisions addendum once upon a time, I would teach it did 6 things. Well, after last year's revision, it does 7. And then I used to teach that there are 3 times the buyer can get their due diligence money back. Well, after last year's revision, there's 4. And so this is it. Okay, this is the newest one. So it is a condition of this contract that the property be conveyed free of any material violations of law, ordinance, permit, or governmental regulation, including but not limited to those relating to the building, stormwater, impervious surface, environmental protections, and zoning, unless the seller has specifically disclosed such violations prior to the effective date. If the buyer establishes that a violation exists, and this is where they kind of change the language, after the effective date and prior to closing, then the buyer must promptly notify the seller, and the seller may cure the violation. Unless otherwise agreed, if the seller does not cure the violations prior to closing, then the buyer may choose to accept the violations and proceed to settlement/closing, or terminate this contract and receive a refund of the earnest money deposit and the due diligence fee. So let me give you an example of what this would look like. If you go to purchase a home that's residential, and upon your due diligence and inspections, you realize that the property is zoned for commercial, and the seller has illegally put this residential property on this commercial lot. You would notify the seller, hey, listen, you're not in compliance with zoning ordinances, and I want you to fix it. That means they could go and they could request it be rezoned, but they're probably going to get turned down. And so then the buyer can either decide, okay, well, I'll still buy it even though it's not meeting the criteria, or if the seller can't or won't remedy it, the buyer can terminate and get their due diligence and their earnest money back. That's what this is saying. And it's pretty vague language, right? I mean, it could be anything. Material violation of law, ordinance, permit, or government regulations. Stormwater, impervious surface calculations. Well, impervious surface calculations, meaning it is like your house and concrete as a relation to your entire lot. And there's like a percentage. And so they would say that like, well, your impervious surfaces can't exceed like 50% of your lot size. And so if a seller put in a pool, well, a pool is impervious surface. If they put in a patio, that's impervious surface. And so you realize that when they added that pool, they're now at 70% when they were only legally allowed to be at 50% impervious surface. Same thing. You can either ask them to fix it, and if they can't fix it, you've got to decide, do I want to back out or do I still want to buy it? So this is one of those very unique things where you have to understand you may be able to get out of it, but if you want the house, you may just have to take it with all its issues. Permitting violations, impervious surface calculations, or otherwise. What you got, David?
How would this relate to someone who built and did not have permit for an addition?
Same thing.
Okay.
Any structural change, electrical change, and plumbing change to a property in just about every municipality statewide, that requires a permit. And so if you built an addition and you didn't pull a permit, that means that, yeah, it is unpermitted and it is arguably in violation of local building codes because you lacked a permit. So you could, one of two things. The easiest thing as a seller is to, when you're listing the property, disclose this room is unpermitted. Because notice what it says. It says, unless the seller has specifically disclosed such violation prior to the effective date. If you put in the listing, this room is unpermitted and they get under contract, they no longer have that out. That's going to be the easiest thing to do, because then they're getting under contract understanding that it's not in compliance. It's only if you didn't disclose it and they find out, you've got to either fix it or they can terminate and get their due diligence or earnest money back. So as long as you disclose it and they get under contract, they know they're buying a house with an unpermitted room. Nothing is stopping us from still closing on it. It's just this very specific provision that if it was withheld, if it was not shared, if it was, that kind of tricked into it kind of thing, right? Yeah.
The problem I kept running into, and it was often, is the non-permitting would be 2 or 3 sellers back, and the present one didn't even know about it, and then everything started to fall through.
Yep, and I've absolutely seen that, because most municipalities, even when permits are pulled, they don't keep the records more than about 8 years. And so if this was an addition from like 15 years ago, you're not going to find it. And so that's where, as long as you've done your research, and this is what the commission says, you've got to do your research, and you got to say, well, hey, I couldn't find a permit. I don't know if it was pulled or not. Now, of course, there's some other telltale signs, like if the addition is showing up in the tax cards like square footage, then that means that it probably was permitted, because they're going to charge you once you submit that permit, so they can charge you more on your taxes. But if it doesn't match up, like it's a 3,000 square foot house, but the tax card says 2,500, it's typically a good indication, not a guarantee, but it's a good indication that a permit wasn't pulled. And so all you can do is what you can do. And so seller can't confirm nor deny whether a permit was pulled. Addition was done prior to their time. Please be aware this area may or may not be permitted. I would argue that you've still met your disclosure requirement for them to go into it, as long as you've exhausted your resources in doing the research, right? Yeah, there you go. Excellent question. Deeds, taxes, and fees. Seller shall pay for preparation of a deed and all other documents necessary to perform the seller's obligation under this contract, meaning any deed reconveyances, any recordations of satisfactions of trust, of course the deed transferring from the seller to the buyer. So on the closing disclosure, we say deed prep is a seller expense. Of course, they are responsible for county excise taxes, state and county excise taxes, also called transfer tax, also called revenue stamps. Remember, it's $1 for every $500 worth of purchase price, and they never change. Now, I'll tell you something cool here. This is obviously one that was just gifted when we looked at it earlier. Like this deed right here. And so if you look at the excise tax, it's 0, because this was just reconveying like a conventional life estate and naming a remainder man. There's nothing there. But if you find a deed, and let me see if I can find one. The cool thing is, well, I don't need to find it. If you find a deed and you've got the excise tax on it, folks, all you got to do is multiply it by 500, and you can be nosy and figure out what it sold for. I mean, really and truthfully, think about it. If this excise tax said, $1,200 in excise tax times 500, it's going to tell you the property sold for $600,000. It's that simple, because even though you may or may not know exactly what they paid for it, because it doesn't say it on here, you can do the math. It's always based on the purchase price, in case you were ever feeling exceptionally nosy. Of course, it says, who are we going to make the deed out to? So you name the buyers. This is yet again important to put their legal names. First name, last name, middle initial is ideal, but not necessarily required. Are they spouses? Are they siblings? So then that way the attorney knows. Another reason why that's important, if you've got buyers who are married, and you put husband and wife or married or whatever on there, remember, the default in North Carolina is they're going to take title as tenants by the entirety. That is the default. The attorney, if they don't say anything otherwise, they're going to say, okay, married people buying property together, default to tenancy by the entirety. Unmarried people buying property together, we're going to default to tenants in common. Now, you could have discussions with the attorney on, well, no, even though we're not married, we want to take it as joint tenants with the right of survivorship or whatever it is. But name the people who are going to be named in the deed.